I have been reading Bernardo Kastrup's new-ish book, Decoding Jung's Metaphysics. Here it is in a smart format. A short book, very to the point, and making the case that Jung was part of the school that can be called German Idealism. So this is the metaphysics which sees the primordial stuff of reality being mind-like or mental, rather than, say, material or composed of physical objects. And given the inflection German idealism, because that links to a tradition which reaches back to the early modern period, and particularly the work of Jakob Böhme, and has a particular take on idealism, which we'll come back to. But I'm very glad that Bernardo did this work. Psychology today, I think, suffers from a lack of metaphysical reflection. It ungrounds it. As Nietzsche put it, if you take away the divine, the metaphysical, the grounding of your reflections in what Nietzsche called the death of God, then you wipe out the horizon, you float freely through empty space, as he puts it in The Gay Science. And the upshot of that in psychology, this unmooring, has been the proliferation of numerous theories and results and ideas, which is quite dizzyingly difficult to discern, to understand. At a popular level, it leads to one psychological idea being in fashion one moment and then another psychological idea taking the limelight in the next. And when it comes to the practice of psychology, I think is a deep reason for the replication crisis, the difficulty that there is of actually establishing experimental findings that then can be replicated. And the reason for this is because psychology is inclined to work at the level of method and of experience without the capacity to discern how that experience relates to wider reality, because it's agnostic about metaphysics. So that's a long way of saying that what Bernardo has done when it comes to Jung is valuable, rooting Jung's work in a particular tradition. It needs doing because Jung himself was very ambivalent about committing to one form of metaphysics or another, at least for the early and middle part of his life, right up until about the 1930s. He was very inclined to insist that he was just an empirical psychologist, just reporting on what he found in his patients and to some degree in his personal reflections as well. But you can't really be just an empirical psychologist for the reasons I was just touching upon. And then latterly, in Jung's more mature life, the last few years of his life in particular, he started to come out a lot more about his idealism, as well as about other features of his findings, not least of which is the paranormal. And what Bernardo's done is look through his collected works and found either the places where he discusses what can be pieced together as idealism, or spotted the occasions when he does confess it. So, for example, in a letter to Victor White, the Dominican priest that he had extensive correspondence with, Jung on occasion did call the fundamental ousia, or substance, the Greek word there for that which is most primitive, most basic, from which everything else springs, and argued that if mental life isn't ousia, then you find yourself in a void, in a vacuum, because mental life is that which is most immediate to us. What Bernardo's very good at too is defining terms, and he pins down what Jung means by several key terms, and that's important for building a richer sense of what this idealism means. So, for example, he's clear that when Jung talks about that which is conscious, on the whole, he means that which is reportable by conscious beings. So it's not just the basic fact of having experiences, having instincts, having thoughts, but is the ability to report them, to know that they're being had, and then also to cognize them, to make associations with wider experience as well, and so build up experience, thoughts, instincts into a wider pattern of meaning. It's what would probably be called metaconsciousness now, that Jung refers to when he talks about that which is conscious. And this is important because he also, of course, talks a lot about that which is unconscious. And for Jung, that which is unconscious can still be experienced, but just not reported upon. So a plant, you might say, is unconscious. It still is actively engaged in life, but can't discuss that with others. And presumably many other creatures are in the same predicament, unlike we human beings who can become more conscious of what's going on and so build it into wider systems of meaning. And then this unconscious part of ourselves, which isn't just part of our experience, but probably is the dominant power, presence, and source of our lives and how we experience them. Jung famously breaks down into two parts. There's the personal unconscious, which is that which builds up over the course of an individual's life. And unlike for Freud, who too had a notion of that which is unconscious to us, but assumed that was made of all that we want to repress, we don't like, we find impalatable, traumatic, fearsome for one reason or another. Jung also thought that there was a kind of pull to the future in our unconscious as well, that which draws us, that which seeks more contact with life, the expansion of things, as well as the trouble that no doubt lurks in what we're not so reportedly aware of too. But the personal is only one side of what we're unconscious of, because another part, and again the greater part, is the collective unconscious. And this is the side of ourselves which we inherit from our place, our times, our culture, but also from our families, our ancestors, our inheritance, and then more generally also from the natural world, which we're of course part of and born into as well. And at the broadest possible sense, cosmic life too. All these elements will have a bearing upon how we know of life, what we make of life, what might undo us as well as become possibilities for us. And this leads Bernardo to what in the book he makes as, in a way, the central core idea for Jung, certainly in relation to his metaphysical idealism, which is the notion of synchronicity. Now, synchronicity is often talked about in relation to Jung's work, but sometimes as if it's a kind of marginal, optional extra for those who are interested in that kind of thing. But Bernardo shows that Jung thought that the fundamental dynamic in life, in the cosmos, is synchronous, is born of synchronicity. And that what we call cause and effect, for example, is a kind of aggregate subset of this much wider dynamic of synchronicity. If you like, cause and effect are synchronicities that seem to have some kind of direct, if not mechanical, connection, whereas synchronicity more generally is the links that form because of sympathies, because of more amorphous, felt, evoked, responsive connections that actually, when you think about it, is the dominant dynamic in conscious human life, we're much more inclined to respond to someone because of their presence than because of something that they force us to do by physical contact. And even when someone's physically present, we respond to them not just as an object in the world, but as a soul, a dynamic that we have possibly deep resonances, harmonies, or dislikes, disconnections with. That whole rich array of our being and our way of living, our path, is for Jung part of this fully extensive dynamic he called synchronicity. He also, though, argued that because we're part of nature, this must be true of nature as a whole, and developed the reflections with his discussions with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli in particular, that Jung then wrote up. And so Jung would see the cosmos as a whole as working through these sympathies that then sometimes, particularly to the scientist, look like causes and effects. You could say that the laws of nature are actually aggregates of synchronous behavior that can be distilled from the wider background through the scientific method, which of course is what the scientific method does. It looks at things in a particular focused way and then draws inferences from that in order to make predictions. And within certain controlled environments, those predictions, of course, can be very accurate indeed and useful for technology. But within the cosmos, within nature, within life as a whole, the synchronous, according to Jung, is the wider, greater dynamic. So I think you can think about this same relation to a plant that tracks the sun. There are clearly parts of that manifestation which can be observed scientifically by considering the biochemistry of the plant and tracking plant hormones and seeing how physically the plant changes. But for Jung, that is a byproduct of the wider sympathy that the plant has for the sun. And so in a poem might talk of the sun drawing the plant or the plant longing for the sun, and that kind of appreciation of the dynamics in nature, the felt, that which moves us when we see such things, when we are absorbed by the sight of a beautiful plant, a tree, to stay with that part of the natural world. Those values that we can see unfolding across nature, that we would call beauty, that which moves us, those two are part of the natural world. And Jung's trying to draw all that in when he talks about synchronicity. Synchronicity, of course, affects us in other ways, imaginatively when we're conscious of what we're looking at, as with the beauty of nature, but then less consciously as well, where dynamics can break in, can interrupt our everyday, or can make themselves known in dreams or strange occurrences. I think Wolfgang Pauli was interested in this because he suffered from what became known as the Pauli effect, that very routinely his presence would, say, cause disturbance in physics labs that he was associated with, and experiments would go wrong or things would get lost or broken. And so widespreadly was this known by Pauli's collaborators that they asked him to stay away when experiments were being conducted. And that kind of disturbed presence that can have a tangible effect on the physical world, but not easily accounted for, if possible to account for at all, by the scientific mode of observation, can nonetheless be observed and understood by human observation more broadly. People recognised that these seeming coincidences occurred and then drew the obvious conclusion that Pauli had an impact, presumably from his own quite disturbed psyche, which is why he got in contact with Jung to start with. And that disturbance, as it were, bled out into the wider world around him. So this account of synchronicity being the fundamental dynamic in the natural world, of course, has huge implications and ramifications for the way that we both study and relate to ourselves, others, and creatures around us. It particularly asks that we bring in the whole of our engagement with them, not just ones which can be, as it were, sieved by a mechanical understanding, but that we consider to what we might practice. And this led to me reflecting upon the distinctively Jungian contribution to the development of our inner life, how we can know of these things that aren't manifested in the objective physical world, but nonetheless are known very keenly within our subjective lives. And Jung suggested, in particular, the practice of active imagination. And this is a kind of meditation that requires sitting still, requires, if not emptying the mind, at least becoming familiar with the kinds of things which usually go through your mind, the preoccupations, the ruminations, the concerns that have to do with the everyday, and aware of that, becoming more capable of perceiving that which comes into the mind that is perhaps not so obviously immediately your own. There's a kind of sweet spot that you can become more aware of and then able to align and wait upon in active imagination. It's quite like a hypnagogic state, the state where you're on the cusp of falling asleep. But in the active imagination, falling asleep is not a risk, but you're instead in front of a kind of edge that, to me at least, often feels like the edge of my own immediate inner life, and is waiting on the appearance of perhaps images, perhaps thoughts, perhaps a word that feels strange for me to have, and yet, of course, has come into my mind. And very typically, I might make a note of that and then wait to see whether it unfolds with a greater meaning, perhaps later in the day, or perhaps in terms of a larger effort that I'm putting into to try and understand the dynamics of my unconscious, my soul, and of course the unconscious life, the soulful life around me as well. Sometimes the active imagination produces seemingly random, strange things, though often then they take on a significance perhaps later in the day. Perhaps it's seen to be a bit prescient to something that happens later in the day. But at other times it can be a side of you that is trying to communicate more broadly, or a place or personality that you're hoping to deepen your relationship with, your connection with as well. And so active imagination would become part of how we relate to the broader world if this idea of synchronicity was more generally accepted, as I think it has been more generally accepted in the past. Of course, it wasn't always called active imagination, but many traditions have similar practices. In the Ignatian tradition, there is the practice of discerning the spirits, whether it leads to consolation or desolation. Consolation being that move within that feels expansive, that feels good, that feels like it takes you somewhere else. Whereas desolation being that which feels constraining, narrowing, even belittling, and so closes life down. The Ignatians developed that very greatly. Psychotherapy, I think, too, is more generally a practice that tries to understand inner life more broadly. A dominant theory in British psychotherapy is object relations, and this is the idea that our inner life is actually composed of multiple facets, dynamics, even part personalities or personalities, the things that Jung called complexes. And they may show up in dreams, they may show up in fears, they may show up in delights, they may show up in love, they may show up in hate. And realizing that we're not just the one thing that the ego consciousness or the self with a small s, as Jung called it, but that we are part of a much larger self with a capital S, as Jung put it. So Jung's metaphysics gives a grounding for taking synchronicity, active imagination, unconscious dynamics more seriously, because it says it's not just part of mere fantasy going on in my head and your head, but actually is part of our participation in a wider reality that also, in different ways no doubt, but that also shares these dynamics. That's what metaphysics can do. It gives you an orientation to help discern what otherwise might be put down as mere fantasy. And this leads me just to a thought about German idealism, because it's a form of idealism that personally I'm wary of. As I mentioned, it comes out of the ideas of Jakob Böhme and then picked up in various ways by German romantic figures like Schelling, and then perhaps in its most sophisticated and complex form in the work of Hegel. And Böhme's core idea, or at least one way of putting one of his core ideas, is that he understood the natural world, the cosmos, creation, to be born of God, but so that God might know God's self better. To put it too simply, but nonetheless I think there's truth in this way of putting it, that we are conscious in order that God might become conscious of God's self too. We have our lives with their potentialities that sometimes become actualities, with the suffering that involves, in order that God might become more fully God's self, might embrace a side of experience, conscious life, that God alone would not be able to enjoy or appreciate. So our suffering has meaning because it's part of this divine unfolding. Our struggles in life are part of a much wider process that we, wittingly or unwittingly, offer back to that wider process. And so in German idealism, sometimes the consolation that the metaphysics brings to, for example, the existence of suffering is understood in that way, that everything that happens is meaningful one way or another, even if we don't fully understand that meaning, because it's part of this ultimately divine process. Now, I think that there's something misunderstood about that has practical ramification as well. I think the thing that's misunderstood about it has to do with the nature of the divine. That in classical theism, God is understood to be eternal, understood to be infinite, and that relationship to eternity as opposed to time, and that relationship to the infinite as opposed to the finite, it falls over our horizons of perception. It remains a mystery to us, but nonetheless one that can be related to, can be participated in. And I think that the risk in German idealism is that God is imagined as being just a little bit too much like us on a cosmic, larger, universal scale. Instead of realizing that the divine origin, the source, whilst the source and so immanently, intimately connected with all things, is also at the same time radically different from all things, even beyond being itself, by virtue of the fact of being the source and the origin and the continual wellspring of being and beings. As a figure like Meister Eckhart, also part of the German tradition, will put it, there is God, and he would see that in Trinitarian form, being Christian, but also there's what he called Godhead, which is the unfathomable, infinitely inexpressible, dark well is the kind of metaphors that come up, the uncreated source of all creation, but that nonetheless can be known within ourselves, even as a kind of darkness, a kind of core that is at once closer to us than we are to ourselves, but also is more transcendent than even our widest and most expansive thoughts and perceptions, analogies and metaphors can be. And so creation is born out of this uncreated fecundity, abundance, rather than being required by God in order to expand something of God's self. You might say that life as we experience it in time is already complete in eternity, and that our coming out and then returning to God will be seen sub specie eternitatis as that eternal truth, reality that certainly for much of the time here on planet Earth remains beyond our comprehension. And I think that this matters not just as a question of metaphysics, but also in relation to how we live our lives. And one way of putting that is how we trust life. Because if the future, if divine life in part depends upon our response, God puts something crucial of the divine life into our hands, there's the very great risk that life starts to be seen as tragic. This is too much for us. Things certainly go wrong. Suffering isn't always, if even usually, understood as being redemptive, as being meaningful. And instead, I think we need to know the classical understanding, which that ultimately life is not a tragedy, but that it is, as Dante would put it, a comedy, that all that's dark, even all that's evil, can one day be understood by us, even as it's already understood by God, to be part of the divine whole, and so lead to light and love and understanding and delight, the old meaning of comedy. So we can not only trust life, but be able in time, and as the saints and sages do, to sacrifice our separate life into the greater whole, at death of course, but maybe at other points in life as well, and how we live our lives. Because we know that the small life that we experience most immediately with our small lowercase self is part of the larger uppercase self, to use Jung's words again, and that alignment is what our temporal lives are about. Knowing that life is not for God's sake, but life is for our sake, as the Church Fathers might put it, because we are made to become uncreated. We are made to know and enjoy with the rest of creation the source of all creation. That is the meaning of life. That's the direction of travel back into the oneness that wasn't lost in itself, but that always was already myriad and dynamic and relational, and didn't so much cause creation as creation being part of that divine excessiveness. Overflow is part of the richness of divine life. The overflow that we know simply in the intuition that what's good, beautiful and true, what's sacred, what's lovely and lovable and love itself is of vital importance, and the effort to orientate oneself around these things and bring about a culture and society that knows those things as well is one that is becoming more divine too. So that's a difference I personally would have with Jung's metaphysics as Bernardo draws it out, and I think Bernardo would situate himself within the tradition of German idealism as well. It was played out in Jung's own life with these discussions that he had with Victor White, the figure that I mentioned earlier, and particularly in relation to the nature of that which is good and that which is evil. Victor White held the traditional view that that which is evil suffers from a privation or an ignorance about that which is good. It's still very active and alive, of course, but its energy is born of a desperation because it's a thinned out version of reality. Whereas Jung had a sense that somehow that which is dark and evil must be part of the Godhead as well. But whilst that difference matters because of how we feel we stand in life, I think that the way to resolve it is partly by discussing the metaphysics and showing up what to me seem like the inconsistencies of German idealism, but also perhaps more importantly, because what we reason is always a reflection of our personal experience, by using the reflections that Bernardo and of course many others, not least Jung, have put together to help deepen our experience and so expand our awareness of these things, both in our conscious and in our relationship to our unconscious life. At the very least, the case has been made through Jung's metaphysics and the way that it touches German idealism more broadly and other idealist traditions, that we're not exceptions in an unconscious or just a conscious reality with what goes on inside our minds, inside our bodies, but that we are part of that expression of divine life. And so finding ways, once again, personally and culturally, of making that a vivid part of our lives alongside the empirical, alongside the physical, is of crucial importance in these times, and is part of our return to the divine life, which we are a manifestation and expression of.